Hi and welcome back to the ITAM Accelerate Process Kit videos, and today we're talking about yet another sourcing / procurement / vendor management process, which is the contract review process. So this is the fourth process in a row where we are talking about a process which is owned by another part of the organisation.
It happens.
It happens, and this is where your influencing skills become so important, because if this process isn't working well, then you don't own the process. You have to influence the owners of this process to make the changes that you need. So we feed into this process because an existing contract needs to be renewed. It may need to be, it needs to be reviewed. So it may need to be renewed. We may just decide, let's review whether or not this is working for us, and we want to do something about this contract because we're not happy with the vendor or whatever. So the feed-ins are actually a number of, and again, external processes. So, there might be a financial management process feeding in. There's, we need to think about the budgets and review / renegotiate the process so that it's in line with our budgets or not. The vendor management process, where we're actually working with our vendors to get the best performance from them, feeds into this process, as does the contract management process. So the contract might be expiring, for instance. And of course, we're also feeding in from the software procurement process. So again, it may be that we need to buy something that's above a certain value, and so we're sort of...
It warrants a contract rather than a license.
Exactly, yeah. So when we're looking at this review process, there's a number of things that we need to understand in order to make decisions. So the sorts of things that we need to pull in, the sorts of information that we need to pull in, are things like the vendor application roadmap. What's the vendor upgrade path? What future versions and additions and things like that of that software the vendor is going to be releasing, or is the software going to go end of life, and maybe we want to find a different piece of software. We then need to take that external vendor roadmap and engage with our business partners, with the people who actually use the software, to understand what our internal roadmap looks like. So, for instance, I'm just trying to think of an example.
This is where we get to choke proliferation of versions and instances of software. So, in enterprise-wide estates, how many instances or versions of Linux or Unix operating systems do you reasonably need? How many flavors do you need to run across? So if a new contract is appearing out of left field and we have to manage it, we can go back to the business and say, do we need to open up a new contract, or can we leverage the existing contract that we already have and procure more through that? Because that can then play to economies of scale if we follow it through to its natural conclusion. We don't just have to onboard something merely because somebody's requested it.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing is, an example of how that internal application roadmap plays out, say, is operating system upgrades, isn't it? So, understanding, we're doing our operating system upgrade next year. That means that the new operating system is no longer going to be compatible with this piece of software, so we probably want to think about whether or not we want to renew this contract. It's those sorts of things that that internal application roadmap will take into consideration, which is different from the vendor application roadmap. So it's very much understanding the future of the piece of software within your own organisation. That's what this step is really, really important. So we might also have, it might be, if it's a support and maintenance contract, then we might need to think about, well, how often are we actually calling on support? And of course, it might be, so take an example of, say, Oracle or IBM, the software itself, we're paying support and maintenance every year on software that we already own. So this is where understanding whether or not you're calling on support and how often you are can actually help you make the decision about, well, do we want to cancel vendor support and maintenance and maybe go with a third party, or actually take the risk of not having any support and maintenance on that software? So this is where actually understanding the value of the support and maintenance that you're paying for is something also to be thinking about.
Yeah, and I think that too ties back to the internal review that we mentioned on the previous page, because if you're looking to potentially sunset technology, but you want to sort of stagger it rather than chop it off. Winding down support then may be a way of, shall we say, steering the business towards picking another title or choosing another title that might be in a contract then at that point. So making that decision, we're retiring that in 3 years' time, support will be going down. It will no longer be vendor-based support that we offer. It will be remedial because we've got plans to replace a product or title with something else.
Yeah.
But equally too, I don't see this enough in the contract review processes that I've generally been engaged with. It's really useful to go back to an organisation and say, we're paying 25-30% top margin for support and maintenance. Where's the value? Because the weight of those calls could be being taken on by the support desk and the technical support teams that you have internally. So if you're fielding 80% of those calls internally, you're paying FTE staff to do that. Is that 20 or 30% offering you real value then at that point? So it's a real conversation to have to sort of maybe chisel down or get that portion of the bill reduced.
Yeah, and the reality is the older the software, the less likely you are to require support calls. Old software gets very stable. Unless you're actively changing it, then a lot of the time you're really not getting the value for money from your support and maintenance. So it's good. It's a really good thing to dig down into. The other things that you need to think about is to what extent the software is actually being used. So if it's an on-premise piece of software with perpetual licenses, we would recommend creating an ELP to understand your compliance position and actually understand, do you have a lot of spare licenses? Could you be cancelling some support on some licenses and reducing your costs that way, for instance? Can you see the usage trends in the software and what do they look like? And of course, if it's subscription software, then you need to understand, are people actually using the subscriptions that you're paying for? And can you reduce those as well?
Yeah, I think the consequence too of not producing an ELP off the back of a contract renewal is that you are steering towards rubber stamping the previous agreement as well.
Yes.
And it's not enough just to ring somebody up and say, are you still using it? And get an email or a phone call back to say, yes, we're still using it. It's to what degree, and this is where sort of consumption data really comes in and usage data, as Carly said. Installation data, that'll give you a flavour or a feel. But as Carly rightly said, you could have a lot of software on the shelf as well that can alter the scale of the deal going forward.
Yeah. So it's also well worth running through the software recycling and license optimization process to really right size that contract so you're not paying for what you're not using.
Yeah.
So I think that ELP is not about compliance necessarily. It's actually about understanding how that software is being used.
Yeah, and again, going back to the one thing too about going back to the business is, and I don't think we have it actually modelled in here, is so maybe that's a point for addition in the next process or the next iteration, is to ask the business what potentially their plans are for the future.
Oh, absolutely. Well, that's the internal roadmaps.
Right, okay, so yes, we do have it in the process then at that point. So, yes, yeah, I had that in mind of a generic approach as opposed to something specific, so yeah.
No, that's what that's about, yes.
Right, okay,
yeah,
yes.
Yeah. So then you pull everything together and figure out what you're going to do. So the options are that you might renew the contract, in which case you figure out what you actually want to pay for. You might want to terminate the contract, in which case we go through the contract termination process. And then we feed out to the contract negotiation process, which again is an external one led by sourcing, but we would be advising obviously. And our advice is being pulled together in the contract review process. And of course, the other thing you might want to do is think about getting a new, particularly for support and maintenance, for instance, getting a new vendor. So going out to market and doing a tender or an RFP. So, yeah. And of course, you have to actually pay the money down. So you need to go out, feed out to your procurement process, software procurement process.
It's all about the money.
It's always all about the money. Most of the time, at any rate. Anyway, so there we go. That's the contract review process.
Okay, well, thanks very much, guys. As ever, please like, subscribe. Feel free to post comments. I'm sure there are plenty of war stories out there that you can wax lyrical on. We'd love to read them. We'd love to comment on them. So do engage.
See you later.
Take care.